So you walk into a bank or maybe a crowded concert venue or even just the lobby of your office building.
Yeah, somewhere you go every day.
Exactly. And you see someone standing by the door. They've got the uniform, the radio clipped to their shoulder, maybe a plastic badge, and often a handgun on their hip.
Right, the whole setup.
Yeah, the whole visual package. And instantly, your brain does this subconscious calculation. You look at them and think, okay, I am safe. Like if something terrible happens, that person is going to handle it.
Because that's what the uniform signals to us.
Right. But today, we're getting into a deep dive based on a really hard-hitting piece of writing that argues that entire calculation, that whole American security industry, basically is built on a dangerous fantasy.
It's a jarring realization. Because what this source material argues is that society has entirely confused the visual trappings of authority with the actual capability to protect human life.
Oh, for sure.
I mean, the author makes this really compelling case that just handing someone a uniform and a gun does not magically rewrite their nervous system to handle extreme violence.
Okay, let's unpack this because the article we're looking at today is by Herfel Torres of Tech, and it draws heavily on the teachings of Garret Machine.
Yeah, and Garret Machine's background is crucial here.
Totally. For context, he's a former operator in Israel's Dovdevan unit, which is an elite undercover counterterrorism force.
Right, so we aren't just talking about, guarding a mall.
Not at all. These operators operate deep in hostile environments where recognizing and responding to violence is literally a daily requirement. So this material isn't just a critique of the industry. It's this deeply psychological look at how human beings actually function under extreme pressure.
What's fascinating here is the core tension the author identifies right out of the gate. We are looking at a massive systemic gap between receiving government permission to work, which, let's be honest, is all a guard license really is, and actually possessing operational readiness in a life-or-death crisis.
Yeah, it's like a totally different universe.
Exactly. The American system is effectively conflating an administrative checklist with physical and psychological courage.
And I really want to get into the granular mechanisms of how that administrative checklist actually works. Because for a lot of the industry, that minimum licensing requirement has quietly become the ceiling.
Sad but true.
Right. So the text walks us through the typical certification process. Basically, you complete a short course, usually just a few hours.
Yeah.
You pass a multiple-choice written test, and then you do a basic firearms qualification.
And we really have to look closely at what that firearms qualification entails.
It's not what people think it is.
Not at all. The author points out that a student can get an armed security card without ever experiencing a realistic high-stress scenario. I mean, they never have to make a split-second decision while someone is screaming at them.
Wow.
They don't have to treat a traumatic injury or physically move another human being to safety when they are completely physically exhausted.
They just shoot at a stationary paper target in broad daylight.
Right.
While an instructor literally announces exactly what is about to happen and what they need to do, the author has this really pointed critique where they write, the paper does not move, the paper does not scream, the paper does not shoot back.
That line really sticks with you.
It does. But, let me play devil's advocate here for a second. Because we do this in other areas of life, isn't a baseline requirement better than having absolutely no standard at all?
I mean, I can see why people would think that.
Like, think about it like getting a driver's license. Passing a basic driving test doesn't mean you are a professional race car driver, but it proves, the basic rules of the road. It shows, which pedal is the brake and which is the gas. So doesn't standardizing the basics provide at least some level of public safety?
Well, I see the logic in that, but the source firmly deconstructs that exact analogy.
Okay, how so?
Because a driving test prepares you for normal, predictable traffic, where everyone is largely following the same rules. It does not prepare you for a demolition derby where other drivers are actively trying to run you off the road and destroy your vehicle.
Oh, wow. That's a great way to put it.
Yeah, the text argues that the American security market chronically confuses equipment and basic administration with actual operational mindset. Knowing how to pull a trigger on a flat range is like knowing where the gas pedal is. It tells us literally nothing about your ability to navigate an active ambush.
That distinction between equipment and mindset is everywhere in this text. The author explicitly calls out the industry's obsession with buying gear.
Oh yeah, the gear craze.
Right. Like new pistols, custom optics, body armor, radios. There's this funny line where they mock the trend of buying tactical pants with enough pockets to invade a small country.
It is humorous, but the physiological reality underneath that observation is deadly serious. Equipment merely supports capability. It does not manufacture it.
Right, you can't just buy competence.
Exactly. Let's look at what actually happens to the human body under extreme stress. When a sudden, violent threat appears, your heart rate can instantly spike to 180 beats per minute.
180. That's insane.
Yeah, and at that level of sudden physiological arousal, blood pulls away from your extremities and goes to your major organs. You literally lose fine motor skills. Your hands feel like they're wearing thick winter gloves.
Just from the adrenaline.
Right. You also experience auditory exclusion, where you stop hearing sounds, and tunnel vision narrows your field of view.
So basically, having a highly customized, expensive firearm doesn't matter if your fingers physically cannot manipulate the safety catch because your nervous system is in total overdrive.
That is the absolute crux of the argument. If you cannot manage your own fear, process information, and make decisions when your nervous system is essentially crashing, that expensive equipment is entirely useless.
You're just holding an expensive prop at that point.
You are, as the text says, simply better equipped to fail. A certificate is not courage, and a qualification card cannot reverse an adrenaline dump.
So if the American reliance on minimum standards and fancy gear is basically a fantasy, what does actual functional doctrine look like?
Well, that brings us to the Israeli model.
Right, specifically through the lens of Garret Machine's teachings. And it introduces a very uncomfortable truth for the American industry. The Israeli model operates on a fundamentally different sequence. They train fighters first and security professionals second.
While America frequently does the exact opposite, we train guards first, and sometimes barely even that, and we just hope they miraculously transform into fighters when bullets start flying.
Just crossing our fingers, basically.
Yeah. And as the author notes, hope is not doctrine. It is not a strategy. It is literally gambling with other people's lives.
Now, I do want to address a red flag regarding the terminology here. We are using the word warrior, and for the everyday listener, that word can carry some serious baggage.
Oh, absolutely.
When someone hears about a warrior-first doctrine, they might imagine like a vigilante or an aggressive hothead who's just itching for a fight, someone with a massive ego looking for an excuse to draw their weapon.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it is crucial to understand that a true warrior mindset is the exact opposite of an aggressive hothead. The text explicitly addresses this.
How did he define it?
A professional warrior is not an angry person. They are disciplined. They are intensely observant. They are legally grounded. The warrior mindset is about accepting the very heavy burden of responsibility, recognizing that deterrence might fail.
Right.
Verbal commands might fail. And at that exact moment, someone has to act without hesitation and apply lawful force.
So how does the Israeli sequence actually build that capability? Because obviously it's not just a weekend licensing course in a hotel conference room.
No, it is a multi-stage pipeline designed to stress test the nervous system before the person ever puts on a security uniform. It begins with a combat foundation. They select from a pool of people who have already developed discipline and physical resilience.
But just being in combat isn't enough.
Exactly. Combat service alone doesn't automatically qualify someone. It just provides the raw material.
Gotcha. So from that foundation, they move to rigorous selection. The text says they induce exhaustion, impose heavy cognitive loads, and demand that candidates make complex decisions when they were already physically depleted.
They want to see what happens when the candidate's initial plan falls apart.
Right, because that's when the real test begins.
Once they prove they can function under that induced stress, then comes specialization. That is where they learn the specific security skills like access control, surveillance detection, emergency medicine, route planning, and finally, continuous evaluation.
Contrast that with the American model described in the text, where we take an inexperienced person, put them at a door with a clipboard and a checklist, and basically just tell them to call someone more qualified if a serious problem happens.
Which is fine for a broken window.
Right. That might work if someone refuses to leave the lobby, but it is catastrophic if you are facing an active killer.
Because you cannot invent a tactical response in the middle of chaos. We've discussed the theory of this mindset, but the source provides stark historical examples to prove what happens when that theory crashes into reality. The brain needs a preloaded script to follow when the heart rate spikes.
Yeah, the historical case studies were incredibly compelling. The author brings up the assassination attempt on President Ronald Reagan on March 30th, 1981.
A textbook example.
John Hinckley Jr. fired 6 rounds outside the Washington Hilton. That entire shooting happened in roughly 1.7 seconds.
Think about how fast that is. And in those 1.7 seconds, the protective detail demonstrated what actual preparation looks like.
It's unbelievable. Agent Timothy McCarthy literally stepped in front of the president and took a bullet to the chest, physically widening his stance to shield Reagan.
And at the same time,
Yet, simultaneously, Agent Jerry Parr shoved Reagan into the limousine, threw his own body on top of the president, instantly recognized that Reagan's medical condition was deteriorating because he was coughing up frothy blood, and immediately diverted the vehicle to the hospital instead of the secure safe house.
the profound point the author makes here is about the total absence of cognitive lag. There was no committee meeting on the sidewalk.
Nobody pulled out a policy manual.
Right. They didn't ask for permission to change the driving route. They acted. But they didn't act out of nowhere. That response was created long before the first shot was ever fired through rigorous selection, extreme repetition, and decisions that were made in advance.
Which leads to arguably the most crucial quote from the entire text. The author states, "During a real attack, people rarely rise to the level of their imagination. They generally fall to the level of their preparation."
That is so powerful.
It really is. That concept, falling to your preparation, applies to so much more than just security. The incident doesn't wait for you to find your bravery. It just reveals whether or not you are prepared to act.
The source imparts a chilling contrast by placing the Reagan details preparation alongside other tragic historical examples where either the system or the individual mindset completely failed, despite the presence of armed personnel.
Yeah, the text brings up the massacre at Columbine High School in April 1999.
And impartially looking at Columbine, it represents a massive systemic failure of doctrine. At the time, the prevailing law enforcement doctrine for an active shooter was containment.
Meaning they just stayed outside.
Right. Officers initially set up a perimeter outside, establishing a safe boundary, while victims remained trapped inside with the attackers for an extended period. The system itself dictated waiting for a specialized SWAT team rather than immediately pushing in to stop the killing.
Wow.
It was a failure of doctrine that eventually forced a total systemic reconsideration of how police respond to active killers.
And then the text looks at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland in February 2018. Unlike Columbine, the modern doctrine to immediately enter and neutralize the threat was well established by then.
It was the standard.
Right. Furthermore, there was an armed, uniformed school resource officer physically on the scene. Yet, he remained outside taking cover while the attack continued inside the building.
It's incredibly tough to read.
The author points out the incredibly difficult truth of that day. A firearm was present. A uniform was present. A radio was present. But the required action was not.
It is an uncomfortable lesson, but the text insists we face it. Possessing the tools of protection does not make someone a protector. The uniform does not conceal the absence of mindset.
It's just fabric.
Exactly. When the chaos hits, a person facing extreme task saturation and auditory exclusion will simply freeze if their brain has no preloaded script for the violence. The crisis always exposes the truth.
So, knowing that equipment and a uniform absolutely will not save you, what exactly are the capabilities a professional must possess? Garret Machine breaks this down into 4 non-negotiable pillars of a protector.
These are the core competencies that you simply cannot learn in a short licensing course.
Definitely not. What's the first one?
The first pillar is self-knowledge under pressure. A professional has to know exactly how their mind and body function when they are terrified, exhausted, and confused.
That goes back to what you said earlier about the adrenaline dump.
Exactly, the 180 beat per minute spike. When your vision narrows and your hands shake, do you freeze? Do you keep communicating? Will you keep fighting when your original plan completely falls apart?
And you cannot just guess how you will react. As the text notes, confidence is inexpensive when nobody is shooting.
That's a great line.
Yeah, the very first time you find out how your nervous system reacts to extreme fear should not be during an actual attack on the people you were hired to protect. You have to be stress tested beforehand, so you learn how to consciously breathe and force your brain back into an analytical state.
Which leads directly to the second pillar, decisions made before the emergency.
Meaning, you can't figure it out on the fly.
Right. Violent incidents unfold much faster than the human brain can process them in real time. If you have to observe a threat, orient yourself to it, decide what to do, and then act, you will be too late. There is no time to invent a response.
You have to establish it all in advance. You map out the evacuation routes, you assign medical functions, you determine exactly who has decision-making authority if the primary leader goes down.
It has to be muscle memory.
Right. You rehearse it to the point of muscle memory. So when the chaos hits, you aren't seeing an entirely new problem. You are seeing a problem you have already studied and solved. You completely bypass the decision-making phase and move straight to action.
The third pillar focuses on controlled familiarity with violence. Good people naturally resist hurting others. We are conditioned by society to avoid violence, which is, a positive trait in everyday life.
Obviously, yeah.
But in an active attack, that societal conditioning becomes a fatal vulnerability. Hesitation gives the aggressor time to kill. The preparation here is not about teaching people to enjoy violence or act aggressively.
It is about overcoming the societal taboo of using force. The goal is stopping the threat, not punishing the attacker, not acting out of anger or ego, just neutralizing the danger.
Because the attacker won't hesitate.
Exactly. Because if you hesitate out of a reluctance to use violence, you are abandoning innocent people to someone who has absolutely no hesitation at all. You have to be familiar enough with physical confrontation that it doesn't shock you into paralysis.
And recognizing that violence requires a specific mindset brings us to the fourth pillar, the ability to think like an attacker.
This one really clicked for me because it's exactly like cybersecurity.
Oh, that's a good comparison.
Right. If you run a tech company, you don't just check a box that says firewall active and assume you are safe. You hire white hat hackers to actively try and break into your system. You want them to find the vulnerabilities before the malicious hackers do. It's the exact same concept in physical security. You have to invert your thinking.
It is threat-informed planning. A typical minimally trained guard walks around a building and just confirms that a door is physically locked.
Check the box, move on.
Right. A professional security officer looks at that same door and asks, how would I defeat this lock if I really wanted to get in? They look for predictable routines in the staff. They look at blind spots in the camera coverage.
Asking the hard questions.
They ask what happens to the perimeter security during a fire alarm or a shift change.
They aren't just occupying space in a lobby. They are actively looking at the facility through the eyes of the adversary. And as the author notes, this isn't paranoia. It's professional preparation.
It's doing the actual job.
But if building a true protector requires this incredibly intense, specialized preparation across all four of these pillars, why is the American industry so flooded with underprepared guards?
It ultimately comes down to the business model of the American training industry. The source dives into this quite critically. We have fundamentally confused education with attendance.
Okay, what does that mean in practice?
We have certificate mills where people pay for a weekend program, they sit in a chair, they don't cause trouble, and they graduate.
The author puts it so bluntly, saying, when everyone passes, the certificate does not identify excellence. It identifies payment.
It's harsh, but accurate.
Serious professions like medicine or aviation use strict standards to weed out people who cannot do the job safely. Unserious professions just lower the standard until nobody fails, print a plastic certificate, and pretend the problem is solved.
And that illusion of safety is exactly what we're talking about today.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though, because when people hear all this criticism of the training standards, a very common assumption pops up.
I think I know where you're going with this.
People think, okay, the civilian training is bad. Don't we just solve this by exclusively hiring military veterans or former police officers for private security, like they've already been tested in the real world?
It's a natural assumption, but the text actually uses the Israeli model to heavily scrutinize that exact idea. Combat experience or a law enforcement background is incredibly valuable raw material, absolutely. But it is not a free pass to assume present competence in a security role.
Why doesn't that experience translate perfectly? I mean, if you've been in a war zone, shouldn't you be able to guard an office building?
Because the geometry and rules of engagement are totally different. A combat soldier operates within a highly coordinated fire team, often with the ability to lay down suppressing fire and call in support.
Right, a massive support system.
A civilian security professional often works solo in a crowded environment filled with innocent bystanders where the rules regarding the use of force are drastically more restrictive.
That makes a lot of sense.
The author notes that some excellent combat soldiers actually make very poor security professionals. They might lack the patience required for observation, or they might struggle with de-escalation communication skills, emotional control in a civilian environment, or protective judgment.
The text phrases it perfectly. We sometimes worship resumes without evaluating current performance. What you did 20 years ago in a different environment is impressive, but the relevant question is whether you can perform this specific mission today.
Exactly. Past experience matters, but present competence matters more.
Which is exactly why the Israeli model doesn't just ask if someone served it, actively selects and evaluates them for the specific realities of a protective role.
So, bringing this all together into some actionable takeaways. The author readily admits that America cannot just copy and paste the Israeli system.
Right. We have different laws, a different civilian culture, and a completely different military structure.
But, as the source insists, that does not excuse the dangerously weak standards we currently have. We can stop making excuses.
There are concrete steps that can be taken immediately, right? Security organizations can start actually selecting candidates based on psychological temperament rather than just accepting anyone whose payment clears.
They can require baseline physical readiness.
They can implement rigorous force-on-force training where the opponent is a thinking, reacting human being firing non-lethal marking rounds rather than a stationary paper target.
They can evaluate a candidate's performance under physical exertion and time pressure to see how their nervous system handles the stress. And crucially, they can establish meaningful failure standards.
Meaning you actually have to be able to fail.
Right. You have to be willing to fail people who are not up to the task of protecting human life. The law establishes the bare minimum baseline of compliance. But as the text powerfully argues, professionals should be embarrassed to live at the absolute minimum.
Build protectors, not costumes. That really is the core message of this entire deep dive. A plastic guard card is not a shield. A uniform is not courage. A pistol is not competence.
It's about the person, not the gear.
You have to train the fighter, educate the professional, test the protector, and only then put them between innocent people in danger.
This raises an important question, not just about the security industry, but about our own daily lives. Moving away from the visual expectation of safety and demanding the actual verified capability to provide it.
It is something to really chew on, and I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over as you go about your day. We started by talking about that subconscious calculation you make when you see a uniform, that comforting feeling of safety.
Right, relying on the badge.
But if a uniform and a badge often merely represent well-dressed theater rather than actual capability, then the responsibility for your safety shifts back to you. If the system's preparation might fail, what is your preparation?
That's a sobering thought.
If an incident happens in that bank lobby, you might not be able to rely on the purser in the costume. You might have to be your own first responder. How prepared are you to stop, evaluate, and act when your own heart rate hits 180 beats per minute? Think about it. We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.